and I will start the webinar in 1 minute from now.
3, 2, 1. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. My name is Lê Thu Hường. I'm a program specialist at the section of education policy, the division for policy and lifelong learning system here at UNESCO. It is a great pleasure for me to be the host of this webinar today. So before we get started, I would like you to spend a minute just to go through some quick technical guidelines for participating in this webinar. Next slide, please. The language of the webinar is in English and French. To listen to the language of your choice, you click on the interpretation you see on the screen. You can also choose to hear the interpreted language only by clicking mute original audio as shown in the box at the bottom left of your screen. Next slide, please. If you would like to ask questions, please use the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. And now please mute your microphone so that we can get started. And that's it. And now enjoy the webinar. Thank you. I would like to give the space now to Mr. Boren Chakun, Director, Division of Policy and Lifelong Learning System at UNESCO, who will open the webinar. Mr. Chakun's work focuses on global trends in reforming education and training system for skill development in the context of 2030 Sustainable Development Agenda. He has conducted a range of policy reviews and skill system diagnosis and has authored various articles and books on skill development and life skill learning. So now the floor is yours, Boren.
Thank you very much, Wong, and good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. Bonjour à tout le monde. I would like to welcome all of you to this webinar, where we will be discussing about the COVID-19 and its implication for learning assessment. Today is an important day. We have been launching the TIMSS 2019. We discussed how international survey can inform our understanding about the education quality, inclusiveness, and equity. We have also discussed how this can inform the progress in Sustainable Development Goal 4. But the focus this afternoon will be about what have we learned from the COVID-19 crisis? What are the implications for assessment? And how we can ensure that the learning assessment can help us address the challenges that we are facing in responding to the crisis, during the recovery, for resilience building, and for reimagining education, imagining education that we want all. So it's not another webinar about COVID only, but it's also about what we have learned during the last few months. And unlike the series of webinars that we have been organizing and that we also cover, where we covered also learning assessment and education responses, we would like to explore today from those unprecedented experiences, new and innovative and maybe sustainable solution that could be taken for the future. So it's about looking at the experience, but to build the future. As I mentioned in the beginning, this webinar is organized back-to-back following the launch of the TIMSS 2019 result this morning. And as a reminder to all of us of the critical importance of evidence, data, and insight that such type of learning assessment are generating and helping in improving students' learning. So for those who have been with us this morning, welcome back. For the newcomers, welcome to you to this webinar. Dear colleagues, as you know, the results of learning assessment such as those of TIMSS 2019, give us a retrospective understanding of how and what students have learned and what may hold us back from making progress in the learning journey, particularly in achieving the SDG 4 goals. All of this information is necessary for validating and certifying the learning, but is also to help teachers to improve instruction and pedagogy, planners to design and improve curriculum and education programs, policymakers to decide on education goals, trade-offs, resource allocation, and most importantly, to leave no one behind and to ensure quality and equitable learning for all. These results also remind us whether we are parents, teachers, communities, ministries, employers, civil society, international organizations and donors, about our responsibility for children's learning. But learning assessment also permits us to look, and as I said, to the future. The COVID-19 pandemic is certainly the test bed for how we could and should respond to the most prolonged and widespread educational disruption ever seen, to build back better and more equally, but to reimagine the future. Through learning assessment, we can know the factors that influence student learning at individual, at school, community, family, state, national, regional, and international level. And subsequently, we can inform and change the teaching and learning processes, the alignment of curriculum, teaching, learning, and learning outcomes. And of course, what we have learned from the COVID-19 is an important source for our discussion about the future. So looking at the past will help us shape our future. Of course, the international community has to align its objectives and goals and work together. For this, we need public sector, but also we need civil society. We need private sector. We need other stakeholders like academia, researchers to engage in this endeavor. The global community reimagined and effectively reinvented education as we know it. The private and public sector came together to bridge the divide and to find solutions for the crisis. For example, UNESCO launched the Global Education Coalition that mobilized more than 160 organizations and partners to ensure the continuity of learning and to leave no one behind. This is an example of the international solidarity, cooperation, and multilateralism. But we know that COVID-19 has changed the way we teach and learn, and thus the way we assess and monitor student learning. But we have still some questions that we need to ask and we need to engage with. How do we need to think differently about learning outcomes and the monitoring of learning for post-COVID-19? Do they require new tools and modalities for learning assessments? How can technology change learning assessment practices? What is the trade-off between high-stake exams and low-stake exams? What is the trade-off between formative assessment and summative assessment? Those are questions that we need to address. These are some of the questions that hopefully will be discussed today among our panelists and speakers. This webinar, where we are joined by experts from around the world, will think through and hopefully to come up with new ideas, new thinking, and maybe new initiative for the future. We hope to share knowledge and facilitate peer learning on what COVID-19 has taught us about teaching experience and learning assessment. To leverage emerging and promising practices in the time of the COVID-19 as a ways of transforming learning assessment for its own sake, but also for improved teaching and learning. And to map the direction for forward-looking research and investigation that can enable learning assessment to support the monitoring and continuity of learning. And to build partnerships, because that's what we need today and for the future. So we'll try to address those questions. Please don't hesitate to put your ideas, the resources, questions that you would like to ask to the panelists in the Q&A function. We want this webinar to be an interactive one, a participatory and lively one. And it's your turn to engage, to critical think, to ask the question, to challenge, and maybe to provoke further discussions. So let's make this session an opportunity for engaging together and for building maybe a new initiative and new thinking. I hope that we'll get some concrete results of our webinar today, and I look forward to listening to the speakers, to engage with you in the discussion as well. Thank you very much. I would like to turn now back to my colleague Litung Huang, who will lead us through the topics that we will be discussing in this webinar. Please, Huang, the floor is back to you.
Thank you, Boren. Next slide, please. No, next slide, please. Yeah, next slide. Yep. Okay, I would like just to spend a few minutes. I have about 8 minutes just to lead you through some of the main findings that we try to draw from the different sources of information, mainly from the JOY survey, UNESCO, World Bank, UNICEF surveys on school closures, just to show you about what we know and what we would like to know more about how countries are assessing and monitoring student learning in this unprecedented time, and what could be the prospect for learning assessment in the future. Next slide, please. Here, as you know, school closure have raised concerns about student learning during school closures, but also for the transition to school reopening. So learning assessment provides data, evidence, and insight about what, how, and how much students have learned and what may hinder or facilitate their learning through different types of learning assessment. Next slide, please. The first issue concerns the preparedness of countries when it comes to assessment from distance. Here from the graph, the result from the second round of the survey conducted between July and October in 2020 revealed that while all types of assessment were not conducted at full scale during the school closure, for example, as we all know, due to postponement, rescheduling, or cancellation of exams, we see that the online support that is made available covers only 30% at most of the type of the respective type of assessment. This means the support for conducting assessment from distance, for example, through online platforms, remain rather limited, suggesting that not all countries were prepared for conducting assessment from distance. Next slide, please. Then what did countries do to manage high-stake exam? As this type of assessment is supposed to validate and certify student learning and can hardly be dropped. Most countries chose to postpone or reschedule exams. There was a distinct strategy adopted for primary education level, where most of the exams were canceled. At the higher levels, in particular at secondary and tertiary level, more alternative ways of assessment and validation of student learning were used. For example, they were replaced by continuous assessment or appraisal of student learning portfolios, or the curriculum content to be assessed was reduced, or alternative modalities for conducting assessments such as online testing were implemented. Next slide, please. As most students have moved to distant learning or maintain a hybrid modality of learning, the question here is if they should be assessed in the same way as as teaching and learning were conducted face-to-face, or how. To give you an idea of how education was delivered during the school lockdown, this slide shows that globally, online and TV were the most used modalities being offered in 33% of countries, followed by paper-based take-home materials, 75%. The level of inequality in access to the facilities and resources required for remote learning was in line with the income level of countries. Moreover, what we've seen here is that more than 2/3 of the countries that participated in the survey reported maintaining distant learning modalities when school reopened. What this may mean is that distant learning is likely to become a norm for post-COVID-19. So the question for all of us here is to have appropriate methodologies, modalities, and tools for learning assessment that do not only match with different modalities of distant learning, but also can ensure equity, inclusion, and fairness. Next, please. A common feature of teaching and learning in the COVID time is the proliferation of online platforms created to facilitate teaching and learning from distance. What we've seen here is that in about 60% of countries covered in the JOY survey, the Ministry of Education have created their own platforms to aid in the delivery of education content for primary and secondary education. So globally, the online platform created by Ministry of Education mainly took the form of hybrid and asynchronous learning modalities. So high-income countries use mainly hybrid platforms in both levels of education, while developing countries, lower or low-income countries, use mainly asynchronous modalities, which allow learners to learn at their own speed. The question for us here to reflect on is what could be the implications for learning assessment, given the prominence and different modalities of online learning. More specifically, I mean, we can ask ourselves how we can leverage the potential of technology to change the learning assessment practices when the conditions and learning and environment for learning have changed substantially. Next slide, please. Innovative ways for conducting assessment have received a lot of attention. The results from the survey also revealed that countries have adopted a number of measures to facilitate student access to connectivity to online and distant learning infrastructure. For example, what we've seen here from the graph is that globally, facilitating connectivity to online platforms through mobile phones was the main measure implemented by countries, as reported by 58% of all countries who participated in the survey. The provision of internet access, for example, through subsidized or zero cost or devices at lower cost, is a common measure used in high and upper middle income countries. What these could suggest to us are the potential use of mobile phones for assessing student learning, as it can help track individual usage, interaction, and performance statistics from learning platforms and apps, and implement rapid learning assessment for groups of students to identify learning gaps, for example. Yet, this also raised the issue of having appropriate intervention to ensure the digital device doesn't get exacerbated between and among countries. Next slide, please. So this will be my last slide, and here is the final kind of some food for thought or final reflection. Here, the pandemic has re-emphasized the need for changing learning assessment, as we've seen. Starting with the proposal of learning assessment, what we have seen is a great of emphasis on assessment as learning, as opposed to assessment of learning and assessment for learning. So by emphasizing on assessment as learning, the focus is on making students become more aware of how they learn, and this process will help them to take more responsibility for and also to monitor their own learning, and thus and therefore help build their resilience in times of change or difficulty. We also see, I mean, from what I presented earlier, is that all the changes will require the changes to the modality of conducting assessment, as well as contents of skill to be assessed, so that learning gaps, not only in terms of cognitive, but also non-cognitive skills, in particular, social emotional skills and digital skills, can be identified, and relevant intervention can be made to address these gaps. Last but not least, learning assessment in the post-COVID-19 should help in the teaching and learning by taking into consideration the new roles of parents in supporting distant at-home learning and the need for tailored instruction at the right level of student learning, rather than just jumping at teaching at the grade level curriculum. The crisis offers an opportunity to accelerate our thinking and prompt our innovative action on how best to support inclusive, equitable, quality education for all. So perhaps one positive outcome of the pandemic is that it will push us to think through and to overcome some of the global educational challenges sooner than what was expected. So I stop here and would like to open the space for the first panel discussion. We will be looking at country and regional experience in monitoring and assessing student learning during COVID-19, school closures, and the transition to school reopening. I would like to introduce the moderator of this session, Mr. Kwangchok Chang, who is the Chief of the Section of Education Policy, Division for Policy and Lifelong Learning System at UNESCO. You have 40 minutes for this session, so the space is yours.
Okay, thank you very much, Huang, for this very thought-provoking presentation about what's happening globally. So this leads to the panel discussion number one about exchanging country experience and also sharing innovative approaches and solutions that countries deployed during this period. So this is not only about sharing knowledge, pure learning, but also explore some innovative solutions that can be further leveraged for the future of education systems. So for this, we do have a group of 5 speakers coming from across the world, representing different regions around the globe. We do have Dr. Karma El Hassan, Director of the Office of International Research and Assessment of the American University of Beirut, Lebanon. We do have also someone coming from East Asia, Dr. Jimin Cho, Senior Researcher, Korea Institute for Curriculum and Evaluation, Republic of Korea. And also from Europe, Silke Snap. Dr. Silke is a Senior Policy Advisor at the European Commission's Joint Research Center. And we are going to have also Mr. Jean-Luc Mutu, Director General of Secondary Education of the Ministry of Education, Congo Brazzaville. And also our colleague from Latin America, regional office at UNESCO, Mr. Alejandro Vera. So quite a great and diverse panel representing all regions around the world. And so as we are having this virtual meeting, let us travel together through, though virtually, from one region to another. And so let me now go straight to the first speaker. So our first stop will be not far from here, Europe. It's an Arab region. Dr. Karma, just to quickly, you are professor of educational psychology, measurement and evaluation, and at the University, American University of Beirut, Lebanon. And I'm not going to present the long kind of profile that you shared. I think this is being shared through the chat room. So let me, Lebanon, I think, is among the countries that reacted early and rather effectively to educational disruption, in particular managing high-stake exams and assessment. So if you can elaborate briefly about this, and more importantly from that experience, what do you see as missing from the current setup of assessment, learning assessment, and as we transition to kind of new normal of teaching, learning, and learning assessment? Dr. Karma.
Good afternoon. Thank you so much for this wonderful panel, and it already looks very interesting with the presentations and the introductory statements. The pandemic came as an addition to Lebanon, with all the political and economic issues that we have, and we had school closures from end of February, and with little online learning, and of course postponement of the official exams and so on. Students went back in around mid-September, first online, then hybrid, then 3 weeks lockdown, then back to hybrid. So it's this unstable situation like all the world is facing. There was a great effort by the public and the private sectors to try and make up for what students have missed, but despite these efforts, I could identify some missing parts that could really make student experience a much richer one. First of all, I think the assessments that are being undertaken should better reflect that we are in a crisis, in terms of the nature of the assessments, their content, and the stakes that they are being demanding of students. And unfortunately, they are not. They are not really, they do not reflect the crisis. We really need to tamper down our expectations from children. We cannot expect children to learn the same scope and breadth of content as in the non-crisis conditions. Exams should be modified, time should be given more, and everybody needs a period of adjustment. A second missing factor, I believe, was that the mechanisms for teachers to assess and provide feedback and formative guidance to students was really were really missing. Of course, this supposes or presupposes that teachers have the assessment and the digital competencies to be able to provide these, and also that they have the specific competencies that enables them to function in multiple learning environments, which is not really the case. Furthermore, I believe that critical baseline information about students' well-being, learning, how much they still remember from what they have learned, their engagement, their conditions for learning should have been collected. As without, as before students can learn, their well-being needs to be addressed. Such information would help in understanding the extent of the gaps in education among students and would help support effective teaching and informed decisions on where and how to allocate resources. So critical baseline information needed to be collected, which unfortunately was insufficient. Furthermore, remedial programs should have been planned ahead of time and prepared to really to respond to the learning losses that occurred from school closures and from the long summer break. And unfortunately, the required support to children who, like with special needs, or those children coming from poor families without access to technology, more support should have been provided for them. So we really we need to put our efforts now on providing efforts for those who need it most and prepare remedial programs, collect data, and really plan that we and all our activities that we are in a crisis and accordingly act in that way. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Karma. You touched upon several dimensions that might have been missing, like the need to adapt to crisis, and also the competencies to cope with the different situations and needs and context, and also resources and anticipation of the remedial programs, so that to ensure smooth transition to learning. So I do see also there are some questions that are being asked, Q&A window. I'd like to invite also panelists to please feel free to answer, to pick up some of these questions. And if you can provide your answer, there are great questions, for instance, from Philippines, Honey Birds, how to ensure the validity and reliability of assessment in this time of crisis. And there is another one from, I don't know where it is, Ivy Solano. It might be Canada, saying that, when we talk about, assessment, are we talking about test quiz only, or is it also some other forms of assessment? And there are questions that are being asked, and I would invite panelists to answer. So let me now turn to, let's travel further to the next speaker, to East Asia, Dr. Jimin Cho. Let me remind you, the audience, that you are this senior researcher at the Korea Institute for Curriculum and Evaluation, Republic of Korea. Jimin, Republic of Korea is among the countries that have something great to share, particularly about organizing a variety of learning assessment during this challenging period, including the most recent high-stake exams, college entrance exams, that was reported widely. Can you tell us how learning assessment during this period have been different in the Republic of Korea in 2020 as compared to previous years?
Hello, everyone. This is Jimmy Joe. First of all, thank you for inviting me as one of the panelists in this webinar. Of course, first of all, the big difference this year in school education comparing the last year is the number of schools operating the online distance classes has been rapidly increasing, and evaluation process with the expansion of the online education due to the spread of COVID-19, the school improvement and its various systems required are being established and applied in Korea. So online education is being used as an education platform on par with the offline education. Especially Korea is a small country and very homogeneous and have only one national language. So we may cope more quickly to this serious situation. And our education system is very systematic, and roles and responsibility of each institution are very clear. But two major points that I'd like to address are how we have dealt with our two representative assessments at the national level and other evaluation at the school level, I want to share experience. First, every year, June, since 2001, which is the end of the first semester, we have administered the national level of assessment of education achievement at lower and upper secondary level to monitor how our national curriculum has been implemented at the school level. But because of the COVID-19, NAEA could not be administered at June and decided to be delayed. From that time, there were many opinions on deciding whether to implement NAEA or not this year. We truly, at the time, focused on why we need to take the NAEA and what we can get and lose with or without the result of the NAEA. But finally, with NAEA, we cannot give up to support policies that ensure students' basic achievement level based on the NAEA results. Analyze achievement and trend analysis results based on NAEA. Analyze subject-based achievement characteristics based on NAEA, and extra. So even though it's been continuously delayed, but NAEA finally has been implemented on November 25th and 26th last month, a week before the other national level of assessment. Difference is that up to the last year, NAEA is a paper-based test. And still, the main test was the paper pencil test, but some sample schools and students who can take the paper pencil test, we provide the computer-based test, which was developed this year. So even though all students who took NAEA will receive the individual reports, but the computer-based test scores are not reflected in our national statistics due to the test fairness issues, such as there is no way to confirm that no one's help was received during the exam. And the other exam, which is called CSAT, which is the high-stake exam, that was implemented last week on December 3rd. Most of the students who wants to go on their studies in college level have to take the CSAT. So it was administered as scheduled. And I just want to quickly say about the how high stake during the test, you know, in order not to fear with any noise, airplanes do not fly, military training is stopped, and on stock market and many of the workplaces open late. So you can imagine the importance of the CSAT, how Koreans feel. But that is why we cannot give up implementing CSAT major national events in Korea. But especially this year, the CSAT is the paper-based test only and must be fair to every student. So final results of the CSAT will be used as the most important data or evidence for the college entrance. So greater planning has been required to successfully implement the CSAT. So that is one of the examples. That is why a week before the exam, all high schools across the country were shut down and completely switched to the online classes for preparing the taking places CSAT. You have probably seen news by CNN and BBC and others from around the world covering the Korean test. The CNN News said, you know, 500,000 students are sitting South Korea's notorious national college exam on Thursday. Is because that is determined teenager in the future. So Korea, we attempt to hold the exam while keeping teenagers safe from the corona and COVID-19. Students had their temperature checked before entering the test facilities and wear the mask through the exam. And arrangements were made to students who take positive for COVID-19 to take the exam from the hospital bed. And some options, such as medicine even, will be shut off to students who can get a high enough score. So it's because the CSAT decide whether students will make it into the colleges and what career path they can take. So anyhow, so CSAT was completely implemented. At the school levels, actually the very specific guidelines for attendance and evaluation especially, and recording of distance classes and attendance classes for responding to the COVID-19 announced in August by the Ministry of Education. It included more very in detail evaluation plans. Of course, because of the time limits, I can say here, but that was announced by the prepared and provided by the Ministry of Education. So various policies, such as allowing the Ministry of Education to decide whether to conduct even student evaluation of the of elementary, middle school in situations similar to national disaster through the revision of the policy in September this year, like that. So the various evaluation guidelines have been prepared to evaluate achievement of the students through distance classes, and specific measures has been established, especially for the evaluation in remote classes. So that is the current situation in Korea.
Okay, thank you very much, Dr. Jimin Cho, for sharing this exciting experience of the Republic of Korea. Unfortunately, your voice, there is a problem of connection. I think your voice has been breaking up a little bit. So please check.
Really?
Yeah, so just quickly, so can you share one of the two things that you'd like to share as you can learn from the COVID-19 period experience for the future? How do you think that we have to improve the future learning assessment, drawing from your experience in during this period?
From my perspective, still the objective of learning assessment is the same as before. And the only educational environment is different now, such as we want to know whether the learning actually happened to the student or not. If not, we are trying to still to find out where we can teach or support the students' learning based on the reliable and valid evidence. That is why still the learning assessment is a great tool to enhance the quality of education. I think I have another chance to say more after hearing all the other panelists what they said. Okay.
Okay, good. Thank you. In the meantime, if you can try to fix the voice problem, because we do have some difficulty in because your voice has been kind of breaking up. Okay,
Oh,
so
really?
thank you very much. I think this is a great experience that we have heard about the need to organize consultations, and also the problem of consensus building, and the question of fairness, and so on. So let me get back to you after we hear from other panelists. Now, I'd like now to come back to Europe. With Dr. Silke Schneff. Let me remind quickly who you are. You are the Senior Policy Advisor of the Unit for Monitoring Indicators and Impact Evaluation at the European Commission's Joint Research Center, JRC. So I understand that your work focuses on learning inequalities in Europe. In this region, with many high-income countries, what we can learn from TIMSS 2019 data, especially your views about possible cross-national inequalities in learning during the pandemic? Silke?
Okay, hello to everybody. First, thank you very much for the opportunity to present our research. It would be great to have our slides. At the moment, I don't see them. If you could put them on, please, and tell me then, fantastic. So thanks again. So indeed, me and my colleagues used TIMSS 2019 data in order to investigate the possible extent of increasing inequalities in Europe. And I mean, research shows that throughout all dimensions, the pandemic will increase pre-existing inequality. So to set the scene, what you see here on the y-axis is the achievement gap between fourth graders, TIMSS score, between those children who have highly educated parents and those with lower educated parents. So if you look at Denmark, so DK, you see there's a TIMSS gap for fourth graders of 30 points. This seems in Europe to be relatively low. It is twice as high in France, Lithuania, Bulgaria, and Hungary. So this variation of countries, we also find in terms of the policies that were, the school closure policies that were implemented in the countries, which is shown by the x-axis, where you see, for example, for Sweden, during the first wave of the pandemic, did not close at all schools, but we have 3-month school closures in countries like Italy and Ireland and Hungary, Bulgaria. So it's very obvious that in Europe, what we will observe is that educational inequalities will be increasing most in those countries that had already high level of pre-existing inequalities and that closed the schools for a longer time. Next slide, please. Okay, so besides pre-existing learning inequalities, what we do is to look at unequal distribution of home resources, which were so important during physical school closures. And here, just give you one example for the lack of internet access. So if you just focus on the second bar, so Bulgaria, and just if we focus on students with lower educated parents, with highly educated parents, 2% of those lacked internet, so it was a small share, but it was as many as 12% of those students with less highly educated parents. And you see this unequal distribution you find in other countries as well, like Hungary and Belgium, Portugal, also Sweden. So this unequal distribution of learning resources from home are very important because it shows that those students with lower socioeconomic background who already perform on average lower had even less possibilities and opportunities to learn when they were at home during school closures. Next slide, please. And the third point I want to make is that it's also important to know how important home resources and family background are overall. And TIMSS 2019 data certainly shows us only something on before the pandemic. So what this graph here shows is something that quantitative researchers call a regression analysis. So if you just focus on Italy, so the last bar, you see that children of lower educated parents have 26 points lower achievement on average compared to children with higher educated parents. But in addition, if these children also do not have many books at home, they perform an additional 27 points less compared to children who have more books at home. And in addition, they perform something like 16 points less if they don't have internet at home, and so on and so on. So this graph shows how educational inequalities can be generated by adding up unfavorable background situations, positions. So certainly home resources here do not only capture home resources, but also deprivation and inequalities. However, I mean, this is before the pandemic. It's very clear that home resources are so much more important during the pandemic, and it shows that inequalities are so much to rise on one side. On the other side, we also see that country differences are big. So institutional differences, education systems, they do make a difference. And furthermore, this all is not only about socioeconomic background. It is much more complex. And this shows that we cannot just target specific groups of children, but we do need formative assessments to find out who are those children who fell most behind in order to help them catching up. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Silka. So you highlighted, the learning differences in learning and the differences in learning outcomes, owing to different factors like, family background, socioeconomic, and access to different education resources in light of the findings or results of the TIMSS 2019. So thank you very much. And beyond the TIMSS 2019, what do you think we can also learn, know about learning loss in Europe, given existing, challenges of learning assessment?
Okay, thank you for asking that. That's a long question, but I know I need to make it very short. Okay, so I try to make it incredibly short. Okay, what I think what we would need at the moment, and that's something that we learned, is we need to have timely data. We need to have data that was before the pandemic, and we need to have data after the pandemic, and that's very difficult to catch at the moment. And I think what we have learned, there are lots of surveys that have been conducted in Europe, which were during the pandemic, which were time use surveys. For example, the JSC conducted a survey on kids' digital life in COVID-19, looking at 11 different countries, showing, for example, that in Norway and Italy and Romania and Portugal, more than 75% of kids took part in online learning, and something like under 40% in Germany and Austria. So we have very different kind of policies that were even implemented. So what I think what needs to, but in terms of how educational achievement was really affected, there's not much data around. And similar to the Korean panelists, we have some countries that have national exams taking place, and from those countries, which actually are even best case scenarios because they are highly connected and had short school closures, we learned that the increase in educational inequalities was enormous and partly bigger than other studies that didn't have after COVID data available predicted. So something needs to be done in order to make low achievers catch up, because otherwise it will have impact on their labor market chances in the future and their income.
Thank you very much, Silke. We'll get back to you with some more questions later. So the next speaker on my list is someone from the Republic of Congo, but I do said he might have some problems. So let me go now navigate to my colleague in Santiago, Chile. So you are Alejandro Vera. So you are the Chief of Educational Planning, Management, and the Sector Analysis Unit at the UNESCO's regional office in Latin America and the Caribbean. You'd like to share the experience of your region in light of LIESE, which is a Laboratorio Latinoamericano de Evaluación de Calidad de la Educación. I don't know if my pronunciation in Spanish is correct. Which is a Latin American laboratory for assessment of the quality of education, which is focusing on comprehensive learning assessment, which also use the social emotional module to understand contextual factors in influencing learning in your 2019 survey. So how do you think COVID-19 has impacted learning in Latin American countries to these unprecedented social and emotional challenges? Alejandro?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chan. And yes, your Spanish is very good, I have to say. and good morning, good afternoon, everybody. And it's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for inviting the UNESCO office in the regional office for education in Latin America and the Caribbean. Just before going to your question, just a few seconds to share with the audience. I think that there is a slide that Terada is going to share, just to let you know that within the laboratory, we are running our FORE study that was implemented in late 2019. I think that the same as TEAMS, this will be perhaps one of the last examination or last learning assessment that have been implemented before the pandemic. So we hope to have this information next year as an initial point for this crisis. Going to your questions, I will say that, of course, the impact of the COVID in learning in the region, in the Latin American region, has been not so different what happened in all the world. But I wanted to point out a couple of characteristics that could be particular in Latin America. One is the starting point. Well, we all know that the learning is a combination of the children that are in a school and what those children are learning. No? I think that in next panel we have our colleague from UIS and the World Bank that they have been working in measures as learning poverty that combine these two variables. And for Latin America, the starting point was not so good in those. We have a high percentage of children out of school, especially in secondary, and those who are in, the percentage that don't reach the minimum level of competencies in the different assessment, including the ones that are run by the laboratory, are a challenge for the region. So before the pandemic, we had in a low situation. So we expect that during this year, the situation get worse in both in terms of learning and in terms of coverage of the system. We are hoping, as every region in the world, a high dropout when the new school year starts. You know that in the case of the Latin American countries, most of them are from the South Hemisphere. So we are closing this year, and in between February and March of 2021, we will start a new year cycle. And the second characteristic that I think it is important to note in the case of COVID is that Latin America perhaps is becoming the region with the longest school closure in the world. If you see for example, if you see the map that UNESCO is updating every week with information of a school closure, currently we have 29 countries with all their school closure, and more than a half of those countries, 16, are from Latin America and the Caribbean. So the combination of our initial point and the fact that our closure of a school is becoming longer and longer, we expect to have big impacts in the learning when the schools can reopen next year. Mr. John, I think you're on mute.
Sorry,
Okay.
So thank you very much for sharing the experience of Latin American countries, uniqueness of the countries in your region where schools are closed for a long time, and also which brings some different also dimensions of learning and assessment. What can I ask us, follow-up questions? So what do you think are the biggest social and contextual factors that may influence learning in Latin America, in the stage of transitioning to the school reopening context?
Yeah. Thank you for this question. Well, I would really like to share with you some new data from our study, but this is under processing. But we know from our previous studies some structural trends that of course affect the learning, and they can be amplified during the COVID. Something that perhaps is not new, but it is really strong in Latin America, is the relation between the income, the household well-being with the learning assessment or learning outcome of the children. You know that Latin America is perhaps the most unequal region in the world. So the distribution of income within our societies, within our countries, is really unequal. This have a huge impact on learning. So as my colleague Silke was referring before, during the COVID, all these inequalities has been getting worse. So the possibility for the students to follow their learning in the context of the pandemic with the remote learning and all the modalities that we have been implementing, of course, we expect that these inequalities have been enlarging. And a second characteristic that came from our previous study, the one that was implemented in 2013, the third round of the study of the laboratory, also detected or also showed some strong difference between countries in terms of the educational background of teachers. You know, in Latin America, we have different learning trajectories to become a teacher, not the initial training of teacher. In some cases, it's secondary school. In other cases, it's higher education. And within higher education, we can have the tertiary and university education system. So this is very different between countries in Latin America, and we are sure that this has an impact, you know, on what happened in the learning experience of a student. So that is something that appeared in our previous study, and we are hoping to have the new data that we are speculating to be ready around mid 2021 to know if it is confirmed or what happened in the training of teachers during this last period of time. Thank you.
Thank you very much for providing some early elements of your findings of the regional assessment 2019. So we look forward to the results of your regional assessment, which might provide some excellent, great and valuable takeaways that can be very useful for other countries and regions. So we have a fourth speaker, but he does have a problem of connecting. So while waiting for him to get in, I'd like now to ask all the panelists one question. We are here to share experiences from your respective countries, from your different regions. My question is whether, you know, your country experiences would have some similarities or differences as compared to other countries of your respective region. And then especially in light of the school closures that affected learning assessment, you know, that might have affected differently across regions, but also across countries in the region. So if you can have some of your thoughts. Otherwise, while responding to this question, can I invite you to, if possible, to address some of the excellent questions that are posted in the Q&A window, especially because there are different questions that are being raised and focusing on the validity and reliability of the assessment. How to ensure what kind of measures are taken, should be taken in order to ensure the validity and reliability of learning assessment, you know, during this context of school closures, and we are not, you know, handling these exams or assessment, not unlike the normal period, if I may say this way. So I do like to now, okay, let's go from the initial order of presentation. So Dr. Karma, quickly, you have, okay, 1 minute, 2 minutes.
For the first question regarding similarity or differences, right? Right. I think we all had the same first experiences. All the it's something we've never happened before, and we were all, you know, in shock, and I think that we were, in the beginning, it was similar to all countries, but then, you know, depending on each country's infrastructure and resources and economic resources and technological advances, I know from the region that those countries that really had a good infrastructure and technology and had good resources, and they were really able to pick up much faster and much quicker than countries with minimal resources and a lack of technological infrastructure. And I know in Lebanon we really suffered a lot because we lacked these things, and it took us a longer time, and we needed support from UNESCO and UNICEF and other you know, UN organizations to help us really cope with the pandemic, in addition to the different problems that we have in Lebanon. So it was a long, difficult time, and hopefully now we are starting on the right track.
Okay, good. Thank you very much. Before
I believe, you know, we have inequities within a country and across countries, and the pandemic has revealed that.
Yeah, that your region, Arab State region, is also comprised of countries of different economic background and development, which are also, you know, translated into difference in country reactions as well as responses. So I'd like to turn now to Dr. Chim-Min Cho. If you can share some of your thoughts about how your country's experiences could be different as compared to other countries in your region, while at the same time, if you can also provide some thought about how to ensure the validity of the assessment. In the meantime, just before you speak, I don't know if
can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear, but before you speak,
I am trying.
Okay, before you speak, there is another excellent question posted in Q&A, which is, ensuring assessment as well as the, taking into consideration the particularity of technical and vocational education, which has internship subjects. And we know that during the lockdown, manufacturers has closed and so on. So I don't know if there is anyone who can relate to that aspect. Not necessarily Dr. Cho. Okay, Dr. Cho, Jimin, you have the floor.
Okay, to save the time, I think, most of, participants in this webinar can hear that there is a similarity and differences. And in Korea's case, we never give up any of the learning assessment at the school levels or even at the national levels, even though, the national level was the, paper pen test, but still we implemented because of variety, a very important reason. That is going to be the difference, is one of the differences with other countries. And I just want to, comment on some of the issues about the reliability and the validity issues. When actually, during this COVID-19 situation, when we have an interview with the teachers, the most difficult, they can feel that when the conducting of evaluation in connection with the remote class, is concerned about the complaints from the students and parents about the reliability of fairness or equity of the student evaluation. So most important thing is going to be the teachers has to build up the capacity on the evaluation area. And especially, whenever we assess or measure the students' achievements, from the first, the teachers should be the experts on, how to evaluate their achievement. What I mean is that when we say the valid measure means the teachers need to measure what they need to measure, what they want to measure, what they, teach in the students. So the teachers should be the experts. They have to really, build up their capacity on their on the evaluation, and especially rely on, for example, in Korea's case, at the national high state exam, how can ensure the validity of reliable assessment? They ask it, and it's because our national high state exam is even before the COVID-19 and at this COVID-19 and in the future. The experts in the content or in the area is trying to develop the items or guidelines of the marking the items. Those kind of things can guarantee some kind of the content validity of the national or school level of the assessment. So I just want to say like that. Okay.
Okay, great. Thank you for sharing your perspective. One of the things that you emphasized is the teacher factors. Teachers should be prepared. This is one of the most important aspects that you highlighted among others. Now, I'd like to turn to Silke Schneff. If you can provide, share some of your perspectives coming from the European region.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. So I think in the European Union, we have countries that might be seen as a best case scenario, like also countries like for Asian countries that fare really high, like Singapore and Hong Kong and Korea in terms of educational outcomes. So because in Europe we had the governments who were able to quickly set up employment insurance and so on, which made the situation for children living in precarious families much easier, right? So I think that is where the European areas might be, and some other countries might differ to other countries. But I think there are lots of similarities that need to be highlighted and where we can learn from each other. And that regards, for example, the digital technologies. They were always in the air. And now the pandemic, these countries which could implement some online learning, they needed, kids and teachers needed to learn. They learned by doing. And I think it's now the time that this gets more institutionalized, digital learning, and a part of blended learning in school, and I think it would be great to go ahead with, if countries can, to implement the infrastructure for digital learning, and as we just discussed, to provide training in digital technologies for children and teachers. So in Europe, for example, we have the Digital Education Action Plan, which tries to implement, to help on these kinds of issues. I think also where we are all in the same boat regards to data lack. So the tendency was to see that exams should be cancelled because exams were perceived as summative exams. We check how good kids are, but this is not what exams are about. They should be seen as formative exams to see where have children lost and where can we help. And hence, I think it would be very good to use these exams, but always with the idea not to judge on pupils, but to assess how good they are and where we can help. And hence to build up data. And we all are lacking data on teacher practices, what works best. We don't know because we do not have enough timely data from schools on what teachers do and what helps the students.
Thank you, Silke. I would like to particularly value that all teachers and learners, they have suffered, and then it's not time to judge again. I think the most important is to put the emphasis on helping, to improve learning and the teaching, and also taking into consideration the well-being aspect in this process. Now, still waiting for someone coming from Africa. We really need to listen also to African experience, Congo, but still he has a problem of connecting. So Alejandro, now if you can share your perspective from Latin America.
Thank you, Mr. Chang. Okay, I just wanted to share with you. I think that I have a slide that can be used to make the point. I think that Latin America at the beginning of the pandemic, as what happened in all the world, took the decision of cancel and postpone all the different learning assessment and examination that was planned. practically all the countries participating in the laboratory, they had scheduled any different kind of learning assessment, international, national, and when we talk about national, both low and high impact learning. And you can see in this figure that was a survey that we conducted around July of 2020. All of them has postponed or canceled the examination. Of course, the situation has evolved, but we know, for example, with the recent data of the survey of UNESCO, UNICEF, and World Bank, that the situation has not changed a lot, and the countries has starting to move to the idea of to make assessment at the school level in terms of trying to know what had the impact of the COVID in the student, or what is the learning gap. So the recommendation of countries that we are seeing in Latin America is doing it at the school level as a formative or a summative assessment. There are some interesting experiences. For example, Chile, the country where our office is based, is proposing a standardized examination, but to be implemented at the school level as a voluntary exercise, but based on the national system of evaluation. So I see that there are some interesting experiences in the country, and we, as a laboratory, that we really act as a community of learning. We are trying to connect the countries just to share what that we will do relating with the learnings next year, and try to learn from one to others to make the right thing when the school years can start again. We hope in next year at the beginning of the year. Thank you.
Thank you, Alejandro, for giving us your perspective from the Latin American regional perspective, I can say. So I don't think that I'm going to summarize the excellent presentations of experience and challenges from the panelists. I hope that the audience would agree to me that we had an excellent panel of panelist speakers coming from different regions, and to share experiences from the countries as well as from the regional perspective. Not only experience, but also challenges. All these elements are really important. I believe that can be further harnessed in order to improve learning and the learning assessment in the future. So on this, I'd like to thank you very much, Jimin-Cho, Silke, Karma, and Alejandro, for your excellent performance, if I may say. Great experience that we think we learned. But I'd like to invite you also that there are some questions that are being posted through the Q&A window. So please, I'd like to kindly invite you to provide your response to those questions. Okay, stay tuned. Thank you very much. And on this, I'd like to turn back to Huang, who's the master of ceremony of this session.
Thank you very much to all the speakers of the first panel for a very interesting and rich discussion. I would like to turn now to Ms. Yuri Benfali, Head of Division of Early Childhood and School, Directorate of Education and Skills, OECD, who will be the moderator of the second panel of our discussion today.
Thank you,
Yuri. Yeah, sorry for the technical request. Pierre, could you turn on your camera on? Yeah.
Yes. Can you see me and hear me now? Good.
Yes.
Thank you.
So Yuri oversees the large-scale surveys, including the Program for International Student Assessment, PISA, Teaching and Learning International Survey Program, TALIS, and thematic analysis, including the development of learning framework, the future of education and skill, OECD Education 2030. These programs are key components of the OECD work to have countries promote learning opportunities for all, which in turn promotes economic growth and social progress. We will explore the prospect for learning assessment for post-COVID-19. You will have 37 minutes for this panel. So Yuri, please.
Thank you, Huong, and hello, everybody, participants and panelists. So I'm pleased to introduce this second session, building on our conversation during the first session to learn from the experiences during the COVID and post-COVID in certain contexts. Now we want to have more forward-looking thinking about the learning assessment and innovation that we want to explore together. Since the COVID-19 crisis, countries and international organizations and other educational partners are all exploring how to better support learning of young people by strengthening our understanding of the status of learning, but also the context and the challenges and environment of the learning. For example, my organization, OECD, is not an exception. We, for example, developed a module on health crisis to be included in the next PISA. It's also available now for the UNESCO IEA Red Survey or in our efforts to support school improvement through PISA for schools, for example. But I know that there are many initiatives, efforts around the world. So we want to listen to our panelists to explore two questions. First is to understand the emerging good practices in the time of COVID-19 as a way of transforming learning assessment. And second big question is to map the directions for forward-looking assessment. And also to investigate how we could support learning assessment to improve our monitoring of the learning, but also the continuity of learning in a resilient way. So to do this discussion, I'm pleased to have with us today 4 speakers who are all global leaders in this area. So we are fortunate to have all of these 4 excellent speakers. We have Ms. Silvia Montoya from UNESCO Institute of Statistics, Mr. Joao Pedro Wagner de Azevedo from the World Bank, Ms. Ramya Vivekanandan from the Global Partnership for Education, and Mr. Hilaire Unkupodote from PASEC. So I would like to introduce one by one and ask specific questions to feed into the discussion. And let me start by inviting Silvia. So Silvia, as everybody knows, is the director of the UNESCO Institute for Statistics and leading the production of data on education and to coordinate the development of indicators to monitor SDG 4, but also she has been instrumental in creating the Global Alliance to Monitor Learning, which brings together assessment agencies, national education authorities, civil society, and other actors in the education community. So our question to you, Silvia, is what has UIS done to react to COVID-19 in monitoring learning? Have you developed any new tools for learning assessment in this specific context, or did you do something to adapt to this situation? Silvia, please.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And thank you so much for the opportunity to actually talk about our work. Actually, we have been drawing on the effort that the Global Alliance to Monitor Learning and the Technical Cooperation Group have done in the last 4 years, that we have many of the colleagues and partners with us in developing a global content framework, a global proficiency framework, and very concretely a minimum proficiency level that is what is allowing us to report for the global indicator. As part of the reaction to COVID, the UIS is actually doing an effort of measuring learning impact, the impact of COVID in 6 African countries. We have the support for that for the Global Partnership for Education. Our interest is to measure the size of the learning loss and also the effectiveness of the different remote learning strategies that the country has been using. And for that, we're going to be using tools that are cognitive, but also tools that are questionnaires that are complementary to actually to understand some of the other aspects. Part of the project is trying to build on global public goods, and I will be referring very briefly actually to what are the ones that were actually to try to generate capacity in the countries to measure learning, because this is actually one of the objectives that obviously as UNESCO we cherish as very important to us. So the tool that we're going to be generated is drawing in a joint effort with the World Bank Group to crowdsource items from countries and international programs, items that are aligned to this global proficiency framework, that are going to be allowing us to build testlets. These testlets are going to be administered in these six countries, along with, in some cases, with the national assessment that they have administered previously to the COVID, or in some other cases with regional assessment that are partnering with the UIS in this effort. And with that, we're going to be able to measure progress over time. And at the same time, these testlets is going to be allowing also to be looking and measuring forward with the learning recovers, and at the same time allowing to connect us these 6 countries that are going to have this common tool that is going to be locating everybody on the same scale of results and trying to generate a peer learning community about those countries, about the mechanism, trying to understand what are the issues that are actually happening. This is really very important effort. This tool will actually be able to be generated as a global public good also, and being possible to be administered after that as a standalone tool for the countries, should the country not have any assessment. It could be also in school, along as we're going to do in the project with the national or regional assessment, but also a subset of items could be actually administered by the country in a household survey base if the country actually considers, or the circumstances actually are calling for an administration that is not in school, because we know that we are actually living in a second wave of the pandemic and it's not clear what the horizon is. I just want to highlight that we're going also to try to administer 3 questionnaires that are around measuring and understanding the emergency teaching and learning context that we have been living, looking at disruption, looking at different aspects of the measures taken by the countries, the use of different platforms, and also to students and some aspects of students that are important for us to understand, like resilience, connectivity, engagement, and resilience to the circumstances that has been actually administered. We're going to be generating three global public goods. The global item bank, that is, as I said, a shared effort with the World Bank Group, the testlets that are going to be there available for countries to measure, and also scaling up tools and materials for the countries to actually to be administered by themselves. And obviously we will need the support for the international community, but this is actually very important for us to highlight. I just want to actually to say that this method has been not possible to be administered if it were not for the efforts that the UIS has been leading, but by the help of partners, international, national assessment countries that have actually kindly shared with us items that has been actually accompanying us in the effort. The benefit that we see is that the provision of aligned data of the percentage of children who meet the minimum proficiency level, the capacity development of the countries to monitor learning progress that is going to be generated through this method, and the significant financial and time saving in the progress of developing and administering learning assessment. For us, it's another step forward in trying to actually to look how we can actually help the countries to measure and to understand what is the progress in these cases of the impact of COVID. But I do think that this is a very important tool that is going to be actually surviving and being relevant for the countries to monitor and to reporting for the SDG 4 agenda. Thank you so much, and over to you.
Thank you, Sylvia. You pointed out many important questions, and especially building on national efforts, we also need to be mindful of the importance of creating global public goods to address all these challenging issues, but also you reminded us the importance of the capacity support and continuously building capacity even in the time of the crisis, or maybe because it's in the time of the crisis. Thank you. Then I would like to invite next speaker, Joao. And as Joao is from the World Bank, I want to pick up the issue of the learning crisis. The World Bank has been in front to tell us that actually learning objective is far from being achieved, and students were in school but not necessarily learning, or an important number of students are not in school. So now with the COVID-19, that concern might be doubled or even tripled, combined with the learning losses. So the World Bank has been focusing on the learning poverty and inequalities. So in your view, how has the COVID-19 changed the pre-existing learning inequalities at the global scale? So please tell us, Joao, please.
Well, thank you very much for the opportunity, and hello to everybody. Well, this is certainly a crisis within a crisis, as we have been seeing, right? The world was already suffering, educational systems were already underperforming, and COVID came, and that is making the situation even more worse. Some of our simulations suggest that private earnings of the COVID generation, or the student cohort that was currently supposed to be in school, can add up to close to $10 trillion, or about 10% of global GDP, right? And these were our estimates, conservative estimates as of June. And it seems that these numbers might get even higher now as the crisis evolves. In terms of learning poverty, what we are also simulating and expecting is at least a 10 percentage point increase. This represents, if we put it in the perspective of the entire kind of cohort of students in primary school age, an increase in about 72 million kids in learning poverty. So those would be the new learning poor, if you will. And we're leaving aside the increasing learning inequality, which is a very, very critical point that some of the panelists in the previous session touched upon, and you've raised as well, right? And definitely what we expect, and we've seen in past episodes of changes in learning performance by educational systems, is that when those changes take place, those shifts are not distributionally neutral, meaning that they are clear winners and losers. And we've seen this, that about 50% of the worsening of the share of children below minimum proficiency level happens because of the shift in the learning distribution, right? And I'll be posting a couple of recent blogs that we have produced that illustrate this point. And I think one point that I would like to bring to the table is that we think a lot about between groups inequalities, right? The inequalities between countries, the inequality between socioeconomic groups, the inequality across, sex, and those are important elements, right? But what we know from assessment data around the world is that those factors, they explain about 13 to 15% of the overall inequality in learning, right, that we measure. So most of learning inequality actually happens inside the classroom, inside the school. And this is an important element that I think we need to be aware of and mindful of, because one of the biggest risks is that on the crisis is that in the aftermath of the crisis, we might get a second wave in education, meaning that kids will come back to the educational system, but the learning dispersion or the variance of learning levels within the classroom are going to be so large that teachers and educational systems in general will have a very hard time to accommodate the needs of kids at such different levels of learning when schools resume. And as a consequence of that, dropout rates might actually increase, right? And learning will not happen, because we know that when we disalign the level of teaching with the needs of the students don't learn. So I would like to bring this point that we need to be mindful not only in terms of between countries and between group inequalities, but also the inequality that we're likely to observe within the classroom, which is even pre-pandemic was already the largest share of learning inequality, right? And it's likely to increase and to continue to as we go forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Joao, also for pointing out to this important issue, and particularly inside school inequality is something that we know that exists, but at the same time, this is the area where we also have more challenges to understand what kind of inequality existing and what factors might be affecting that kind of inequalities and what we can do. So yeah, we want to continue the conversation, but for the interest of the time, I move to the next speakers. And if participants have any questions, please just don't hesitate to put your questions in the question box and we might have time to address these. Okay, then I'm pleased to introduce Ramya from the Global Partnership for Education. And you are leading the leveraging of global partnership. And one of the speakers during the first session also highlighted the importance of partnership across different actors to address the extraordinary challenges. So my question to you, Ramya, is what the Global Partnership of Education is doing in response to COVID-19, in particular in contributing to our understanding about what works to ensure teaching and learning continuity during school closures and beyond. So over to you, Ramya.
Thank you. Thank you, Yuri, for the question. And thank you so much for the session. So very soon after the pandemic began, as some of you may be aware, GPE was able to unlock substantial funds to support our partner countries, who are all low-income or lower middle-income countries, to mitigate both the immediate as well as the long-term impacts of COVID on education. So in total, we've had a funding window of $509 million US, which includes support for 66 countries to sustain learning via country grants, as well as a grant for global and regional coordination, learning and knowledge sharing that's managed by the consortium consisting, of course, of UNESCO, UNICEF, and the World Bank. So in relation specifically to ensuring teaching and learning continuity, and more specific to the topic of today's webinar, a number of these grants are actually working to enable countries to support teachers to coordinate and track learning, as well as to assess learning gaps and to provide remedial learning opportunities to make up for the time lost. So looking at the country grants, there are 66 country grants which were approved. 33 of them actually include support to activities relating to learning assessment specifically. And based on some analysis that we undertook of these grants, we found that the large majority of them are actually focused on classroom assessment specifically. And this includes both ongoing formative and in some cases summative assessment that's being conducted, that's meant to be conducted by teachers during the time of school closures using distance modalities primarily, as well as diagnostic rapid assessment to be undertaken to assess learning levels upon school reopening. In some other countries, we are supporting the conduct or adaptation of national assessments after reopening. And in a very few cases, we're also providing some support to countries to adapt examinations. But really, we see a lot of focus on classroom assessment primarily. And just to highlight some country examples, maybe in Rwanda, for example, there are quick sample-based assessments of student learning, specifically literacy and numeracy in the early grades that are going on in order to monitor the efficacy of remote learning. And by the end of the year, there will also be support to ensure that the national learning assessment system is adapted for remote assessment in the case of future pandemics or future school closures. In Pakistan, we're supporting the country in the design of a distance learning competency standards and assessment framework. And in Tanzania, the country is actually developing an online or an e-assessment platform, which is envisioned to allow students to assess themselves on various topics of the curriculum, but also for teachers to be able to access and monitor their students' progress. So these are just a couple of examples in terms of some of the country grants and the activities that we're supporting. Then coming to the global grant that's being implemented by UNESCO, UNICEF, and the World Bank, there's a number of components here, including ensuring that students are learning at home through a combination of modalities, including text and SMS, phone-based connection, as well as interactive voice response materials. And also, as our colleague Sylvia Montoya from the UIS, UNESCO UIS mentioned, this grant is also supporting the measuring of learning loss in 6 countries and the introduction of a new method to develop a learning assessment building on a new global item and text construction guidelines. So it's really great that we're able to work with our partners in regard to this, as well as the country grants. And I think it's probably, perhaps too early to draw really conclusive lessons across the board. But I think that all of these efforts are teaching us, in fact, a great deal about how to ensure continuity, and particularly for assessing learning during the school closures. I would say that some of the key emerging insights are the need to be flexible and agile, the need to be open to innovation and non-traditional modes of assessment, the need to use a suite of approaches, including things like rapid quizzes, projects, portfolios, etc. And also, and very crucially, I think the need to assure the assessment literacy of teachers, which we've always known to be important, but I think now we're really realizing the extent to which this needs to be a focus for all of us. And in the context of distance learning, we're also working, of course, with parents and caregivers and thinking about the role that they play in supporting assessments of learning. So I think these are some of the key takeaways that are coming so far. So maybe I'll stop here for now. Thank you.
Thank you, Ramya, for sharing these interesting lessons that you learned from your operation, but also from countries like Rwanda, Pakistan, and Tanzania. It was an interesting illustration, but also we noted some of the emerging areas where a crisis has highlighted. It's not totally new, but that's more of the highlight of the area where we have to work on, such as the timely and quick collection of data for rapid response to the new situations, or importance to balance the assessment for the summative purposes and the formative purposes, including the possibility for students to be equipped with the assessment opportunity to own their own learning. So thank you very much. And finally, I'd like to introduce Hilaire. I understand that he would like to present in French, so I switch to French now. Donc Hilaire, so that participants can now make sure that if they need interpretation, they click the button for the interpretation. Donc Hilaire, il est le coordonnateur de programme.
Hilaire is the coordinator for the program PASEC that you're all familiar with. It's the program for the analysis of educational systems in French-speaking African countries. In 2019, you and the PASEC introduced a special module concentrating on teachers. And even if the 2019 study was organized before the onset of COVID, this topic of teachers is something that is of great importance, and all the more so when we are confronted with the problems relating to COVID-19. And I'd like to ask Hilaire the following question.
De PASEC 2019, qu'est-ce qu'on apprend de votre analyse?
What can one learn from the results of your PASEC 2019 analysis? What are the topics, or the areas that we should better study so that we can better understand and support the learning of students in this COVID-19 world? Thank you very much. I would like to begin by saying that PASEC has carried out an assessment in 10 countries. And as you know, this was an assessment that focused on the beginning of primary school. And for the evaluation of the new cycle, because the old one went up to 2015, we after discussing with the countries, realized that it was important to go even further and look at exactly how cognizant were the teachers in these schools. Teachers in primary schools and in secondary schools, but we see that things are greatly different from one country to another. In a lot of countries, the assessment shows us that teachers may present with several different profiles. In some countries, there are a lot of teachers at a higher level, which is not the case in all. So we thought it was important to focus on these teachers. What do they know how to do? It's important, I wouldn't say to test the teachers, but we need to know how different teachers are going to react when confronted with different situations. What are they teaching their students? And we thought that we could give them a test with certain items that would permit us to know exactly what the teachers themselves knew. So in this new assessment of PASEC, there is a new discipline, if you like, the understanding of the written word and the understanding of mathematics. And we wanted to teach those who teach. What do these teachers do when confronted with different situations? How do they react? I'm not saying that the study is all-inclusive, because there is one thing that it's difficult to take into account, and that is how the teachers are perceived by the class. But we have given our teachers a little test that shows how they react to different reactions when faced with their classroom. So that's the 2019 PASEC Teachers Test. The results have not yet been made public. We think that that will be done on the 21st of December. It will be done via video, remotely. We will be holding an event on that day. So there's not a lot that I can tell you today, because you know that it's an extremely delicate issue when you're talking about teachers. There are the problem as well of trade unions and all. But at least we know that in the future, it is going to be very important to focus on the recruiting of teachers and how they are trained. Is their training in line with what they're going to be called upon to do in the classroom? So those are the two issues that we think are going to be very important after COVID-19 in several countries, Niger being one. It's just a question of seeing how teachers present and progress. So I hope that the results, once they are published, will come up, will give data that the rest of the world will be able to take into account as they reflect on the aspect of teachers. In this new COVID-19 context, we've seen there's one thing that is crucial for teachers, and that is how well are they digitally trained. So how do we want to train these teachers in the future? so that they can teach remotely. How do teachers teach their students remotely? We will try to assess the students remotely as well. It's one thing to actually assess students when everybody is present in the classroom, sitting down behind their desks. But COVID-19 has shown us that we have to think about whether we have to change these former ways of assessing students. What will we be doing in the future? How different will it be from the assessment of students in the past? What about IT equipment in schools? There are a lot of schools that don't have computers. There are a lot of schools that don't have electricity. There are a lot of teachers who don't have the necessary equipment to be able to teach remotely. So how do we remedy that so that we can keep a good quality of teaching? It's a problem of having to adapt to the context. We've seen that following on from the study that we've done in our countries who are members of the conférence, we saw that there are some countries that found it easier to react than others. Others had great difficulty in remotely teaching. And in some countries, it's been difficult to work out how to teach using the radio or the television. And a student who is in a village is, of course, not at all in the same situation as a student who is in town. So these are the things that we're reflecting on at the moment. These are the ones that we would like to work on with the countries to see how we can better adapt in this COVID-19 situation, which quite possibly will go on for some time. We would also like to do a little impact study with UNESCO. We're going to be doing this in 2 countries. I can't give you their names, but we'll be working with those countries to see how they have reacted in the COVID context. The results of our test came out before the onset of COVID, but it's important to know what type of impact COVID has had on the children and the teaching of the children. Parents of students and teachers have had to deal with schools closing. So the questionnaire that PASEC has been giving out to the schools should perhaps be also given today to parents, because it is parents who are dealing with the teaching of their children at home. And maybe that way we would have a better idea as to the quality of this remote teaching of children. Thank you very much, Hilaire.
Pointed out to the importance of teachers and to understand the different context of teachers, and it's a great initiative that PASEC took the work to understand teacher knowledge as part of the survey, and this is also promising. So unfortunately, we don't have time for Q&A, but participants might have taken lots of ideas and lots of food for thought, and this is our homework to think about how each one of us in our own capacity to think about the future innovation to improve our support for the teaching and learning. So thank you very much for all the panelists, and thank you very much for UNESCO colleagues. It was a nice collaboration to prepare this session together. Over to you, Huong. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much to all the speakers of the second panel for the ideas and some different ways of thinking that you have brought to the discussion. Time is limited, and I just hope that this is just a start of a conversation that we will continue as a follow-up to this webinar. I would like to now turn to Mr. Dirk Hastert, the Executive Director of the International Association for the Evaluation of Education Achievement, IEA. Probably many of you have seen him this morning during the TIMSS 2019 launch. who will share with us the takeaway of the rich discussion that we have during this webinar as the closing of the webinar today. So yeah, Dirk, you have the floor. Thanks.
Thank you, Huong. Also, big thanks to UNESCO for inviting me to say a few closing words here today, and also for organizing this event as a continuation of our earlier release of the TIMSS 2019 National Report this morning. And as an important reminder to all of us of the critical importance of data, evidence, and insights generated by learning assessments in improving learning outcomes. Thank you to all the attendees and also the participants during this event, especially the speakers for presenting and the participants for their engagement. I think we had two excellent panel discussions. The first looking at country experiences during COVID-19 school closures, and the transition to school reopening and what we know about learning assessment during this time. We heard from Lebanon, Korea, Europe, Latin America, about their experiences monitoring and assessing students' learning during this time as they shared some country learnings and successes. During this first panel, we also heard from Sylvia Schnaps from the European Commission's JRC on the recent work using the TIMSS 2019 data to focus on social inequalities in education and to better understand how COVID has amplified social gaps in education. This has been particularly interesting to see the usefulness of existing and pre-COVID student assessment data to assess possible consequences of the pandemic. And I look very much forward to next year to all the future analysis using the TIMSS 2019 data after the international database is released on January 21st next year. The second panel discussion, chaired by Yuri from OECD with contributions from Sylvia, from João Pedro, from Rami and Hilaire, looked into the future and forward-looking research and investigations that enable learning assessment to support monitoring on continuity of learning, as well as to strengthen the resilience of learners. There is no doubt that this year has been a challenging time, including for researchers and policymakers. But I think there are 3 points that I'd like to highlight from today's event that for me stood out in particular. One, we've seen that there's huge differences between countries. But we also heard that there's huge differences, especially within countries, within educational systems. So it is very, very important to look at different countries, but to also investigate further inside the different educational systems to see what helps the most, who is suffering the most, and what can be done to improve education worldwide. A second takeaway is what I heard several times from different speakers is the importance of teachers and what's happening in classes. There's huge variations, as I said, between classrooms, but as João Pedro said, also within classrooms. And it is very important, as also Hilaire mentioned, that we have a good teacher working force, well-trained teachers that are always up to date and continuously, also in their working life, are trained so that they can do the excellent jobs that they're doing now. And lastly, I heard the importance of evidence-based policies, and therefore the importance of learning assessments. There have been some excellent initiatives mentioned to try to bridge these data gaps, including the international study launched by UNESCO and IEA, known as REDS, or Response to Education Disruption Survey. This study is the fastest timeline IEA has ever worked to and has put us at IEA to the test as well in how we can keep up with these data demands. We are delighted to have countries from around the world signing up for these initiatives and partners such as the European Commission, the OECD, the Gates Foundations were involved in that. The study report is planned to be released in summer 2021 and will give further insights in the current crisis and how countries are dealing with it. This touches also on my point of that I mentioned before. And that is, I saw a strong collaboration also here today between different organizations worldwide. Whether it's the sharing of research and learnings or country experiences. This year has been a time where we have had to think and find solutions together. And I think building and fostering these connections are an important aspect for the future of education research and education globally. So again, I'd like to finish by thanking UNESCO to organizing this and to help bringing people, bringing organizations together to work on improving education worldwide. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dirk and everyone. I hope you enjoyed the webinar. And on behalf of colleagues at UNESCO and also colleagues who joined us today as a panelist, as a moderator, my colleagues from the different organizations. I mean, thank you so much for joining us. And please keep in touch. And thank you.